Some may think the games and books harmless, that they are strictly for fun, fantasy, and entertainment. Beware, they are not. Parents who buy or allow such games and books and tapes are playing with dynamite and their children's souls.
Parents, these shows right here, if your kids watch any of these shows, this is a public service announcement for you and their soul.
They open up their homes and their children to the subtle introduction of the occult, to Satanism, and the malignant world of psychotherapy, mind alteration, values modification. There is nothing benign about these games. They are part of the increasing spread of Satanism and various forms of the occult, a push that will increase in tempo and fervor as Satan's time grows shorter. Come on, babe. Come on, babe. Yeah, come on. You wanna come up? Welcome up. Alrighty, everyone. Hello, and welcome back to quite the ostentatious episode of My Nonsense. Oh my goodness, do we have a doozy today. But before we get into all of that, my name is Sara Streisand, and thank you so much for joining me. On this channel, we talk about all kinds of interesting topics like the ones today, because I am a Christian witch, a writer, an educator, a content creator, and specifically a writer of these two books right here, Discovering and Discerning Christian Witchcraft, which are all about explaining how the words Christian and witch can even go in the same title that you see in here, and also what you might expect to encounter or experience if you decide to take on this very interesting and self-directed approach to a very old yet very beautiful religion. If you don't want to check out those books just yet though, please do go ahead and like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell, because we post topics like the one we're about to get into every single Friday. And if you want to see these videos 2 weeks early and ad-free, head over to my Patreon, where your support is what helps me get all of these kinds of videos together, and where I post this stuff and a lot more on there. I very much appreciate all your support. It is very important in making sure that I can continue spending time on this kind of work. And with that said, I really don't know why I thought this topic was going to be easy or simple, but as you can see by the light shining on my face right now, this is a topic that requires the laptop, because the notes I have taken on this, the sources I have collected, only a fraction of which I've actually read through, and the rest of which now I desperately need to, are a lot. They're a lot, and the rabbit hole that one can bonk their head on the way down with here is so extensive, it's so pervasive, and it opens up so many interesting conversations that are super relevant to what we are seeing going on here in America in the modern day. Here's the thing, right? The Satanic Panic, maybe some folks who are watching this have heard this term before, but it really does feel like the relic of a bygone era, and yet, right? And yet here we are talking about it, no doubt because of all of the things that I have shown you at the beginning of this video. Despite the fact that the kind of little opening statement I read comes from Russ Walton's 1988 book, Biblical Solutions to Contemporary Problems, it does seem to fit a lot of those images, doesn't it? It does seem to kind of go together. It kind of makes us question where the hell the past ends and the present starts and the future is conceptualized. But nonetheless, right? Before we even get into this, let me just paint you a picture of what my childhood looked like growing up. Because if I do that, you might understand why all of what we're about to talk about is double bizarro to me especially, and mayhaps if you grew up in a similar place, you'll also no doubt have a comrade in feeling especially bizarre about it as well. So when I was growing up, right, my parents were two very, and still are two very interesting people. My dad being, a rock star in his own making, someone who loved to play the drums, who loved rock music, who has always been extremely intelligent and critical thinking, and very open to new ideas, to discussion. Someone who, when I was growing up, I would have all kinds of long, like, sociopolitical discussions with, bounce ideas off, and I still love to talk to about all this kind of stuff, and who is all about questioning, just, pushing back, digging into deeper things, deeper ideas, getting more philosophical and existential about stuff, and just listening to music that reflected a lot of that stuff. My dad's favorite band is Rush, and he's also, you know, shown me all kinds of other music growing up, Alice in Chains, and all these other kinds of bands that would later begin informing my more, I guess, heavy metal music tastes later. And then I also have my mom, who is not from this country. She is from Slovenia and grew up in Germany. And there, the whole concept of Christianity simply was not what it was like anywhere in where a lot of this satanic panic stuff is cropping up. Even then, my dad too, right? Like, we're all from Rhode Island being very much not the same culturally whatsoever as any of the states outside New England, especially those more Bible Belt states that are all wrapped up in this kind of satanic panic stuff. This is a heavily Catholic area. My mom, the country she grew up in, the culture she has is very Catholic, and it's a kind of Catholicism that lends itself to all kinds of really interesting, fantastical elements, right? We believed in ghosts growing up, my mom and I. We would have a joke that my opa, who died before I was born, would kind of come over with my oma when she came to visit, because that's when a bunch of supernatural stuff started happening in the house, lights turning on and off, radios turning on spontaneously, all that kind of stuff. We would light candles for the dead. We would, go to church on Sunday with the big Catholic mass and all that kind of stuff. And even then, my mom was very lax with the Catholicism. She was very just about the two commandments Jesus put down, that very love God, love one another. Just don't be an asshole, for my mom's summary of it. That was really it, right? There wasn't anything super stringent about it. There wasn't anything super crazy. They weren't very enthused when I got into witchcraft, I will say, because they still grew up in a place where a lot of this was spooky and scary. But they got over that as well, because again, my parents are free-thinking individuals who listen when people talk to them, wouldn't you know. But my mom was also very interested in fantasy. I grew up with all kinds of statues and paintings of fairies in the house. She loves Lord of the Rings. She loves all this kind of really nice fantasy media. Absolutely did I grow up watching Harry Potter. My dad read the books, and every time I told my mom about how people online or in other parts of America with their evangelical Christianity were freaking out about Harry Potter, freaking out about all these things, about how they're promoting witchcraft and devilry and all this, my mom would just go, but it's not fucking real. She would always say, but it's just fiction. It's just fantasy. What do you mean, satanic witchcraft? What the fuck? Who? I digress. My parents and I always were very mystified by this. On the flip side, though, if you talk to my fiance, he grew up with a mom who was more one of those born-again Christians who told him that Pokemon was demonic because all of those, magical critters were actually demons in disguise who, tried to stop him from listening to stuff like Marilyn Manson and whatever because they were satanic and evil and whatever. And now I'm also going to open this up to the class and ask you which one of us you think is still deeply entrenched in the religion of their upbringing at this time, and which one has completely abandoned it for nonsense. It's not a hard guess. Still, right? Two very different upbringings, two very different cultural approaches to Christianity, and two very different understandings of what it means for something to be satanic or demonic. So imagine my surprise when, me as someone who actually listened to Marilyn Manson first before I understood any of the Satanic Panic stuff, was confused as to how people didn't know the actual problem with all of this, right? I mean, if we just go listen to Marilyn Manson's debut album, Portrait of an American Family, one of the key things you're going to notice in a lot of these songs is that they start with sound bites of what seems to be like some kind of evangelical Christianity or Christian talk show hosts or something talking about how they need to put on the armor of Christ and go to battle against Satan. Marilyn Manson was very much playing into and talking about the goofy, silly things about evangelicals' Christianity's obsession with Satanism and all this other stuff. And just like we have with the Monster Energy drink lady.
Look at your M closely. There's a gap right here in the letter M. It's never connected. So you go into Hebrew. The letter Vav is also the number 6. Short top, long tail. short top, long tail. You could have here in Hebrew 666 on the can. But my interest is the word monster. What do you see in the O? There's a cross.
Okay.
What has Christ got to do with an energy drink, let alone the name monster? You cannot deny that that is a cross. And what is witchcraft? When the cross goes upside down, bottoms up, and the devil laughs.
It does seem like irony is just a tool and a trick that a lot of folks pushing satanic panic propaganda at this time, and even now, do not know how to deal with or register. But with that said, let me also tell you a little something about the satanic panic movement itself, right? We need to understand what it is we're talking about here and why it still seems to be around today, why it still seems to be relevant today in all of these problems that are actually living underneath the surface of it that give us a real reason to be worried and a real reason to be vigilant rather than all the reasons proponents of this stuff say there are to be, right? Because while it seems weird to talk about something that happened largely in the 80s and the 90s, especially in modern day in 2026, the reality is that the underbelly, the mechanisms that pushed the satanic panic flare here are the same stuff we've seen time and time again across so many different peoples, cultures, time periods, and so many different groups that have been scapegoated. And all of this conversation is going to go to show you that if you have a shovel and the time, yes, in fact, everything can be that deep, and we all really should be paying a lot more attention and going a little bit under the topsoil whenever we see people acting out and doing some crazy nonsense. So with all that said, let me tell you a little bit about this situation, brief overview of the Satanic Panic and all that kind of stuff, where it came from and why this situation is the mess that it is. So before I really get into talking about the actual Satanic Panic, I gotta give you some context of why this moment in American history happened in the first place. And that is the fact that the Satanic Panic of the 80s and 90s actually spawned out of the anti-cult movement of the 60s and 70s, where people were seeing a lot of weird cults pop up that were a little bit, some more well-known than others just kind of like goofy, silly nonsense, right? But those cults, like actually, you know, new religions popping up, they weren't just like splitting off from other Christian denominations or something. And in fact, if we look at this source from the time period of the anti-cult movement, you'll find that it's really interesting, actually, this paper. It does go over very specifically what it claims are not simply splinter groups of cults and stuff, but are actually new religions, like religions and cults or groups where people are claimed to have an entirely new spiritual revelation from some divine source, right? So there were a good few of them that were popping up, and this guy makes a very interesting chart denoting where the majority of them seem to be coming from. For some reason, California had a lot of them. Suspiciously, this does not include Utah Mormon groups in it, which is interesting because if we get into the definition of a cult, we might have some questions, right? We might have a little about that. But to note, they did not include any of that in the Utah numbers. So that whatever number is there is just separate of all that. But nonetheless, right, cults are considered, one of the most famous ones being like Scientology, for instance. Other cults being especially in more famous memory, ones like the Charles Manson family, and other ones like Heaven's Gate, and others yet still like the People's Temple, run by Jim Jones. And a through line with all of these that made them make headlines the way they did is the often large cases of like murder, suicide, just attacking other people. In the case of Charles Manson, right, like just kind of taking the lives of several innocent people that had nothing to do with anything. In the case of Jim Jones, just an entire 900 victims of a mass poisoning / shooting event that was just wild. And, you know, there are many different reasons why these things would attract the amount of people that they did, would get the following that they did. And certainly they're not the only type of cult as well. Other ones like Nexium were actually a way more recent one, with all kinds of court proceedings about that, actually ending pretty much only a few years ago, really, within the last decade, which is wild to think about. And other ones also like the Sullivanians, where a big defining factor of these ones was just serious abuse and high control authoritarian behavior that, a lot of people, when they escaped these cults, would go to testify on years later, and result in a lot of big mess for those cult leaders, and for good reason, because some of that stuff is shocking and graphic and wild, and, we just don't need to get into all of that right here. But it was bad. It was very bad. And, these cults, they could have all kinds of different origins. Some of them were religious in nature, like Heaven's Gate. Heaven's Gate's sounding suspiciously like a lot of modern starseed stuff, where this, the leader of this really did think that the comet coming by would have a UFO behind it that would, help everyone in this cult ascend to heaven when it came by. And so they all just kind of, poisoned themselves in a field as the comet passed, and that was the end of that. Sounds a lot like folks who are nowadays pushing starseed ideology, this idea that there are aliens out there who are, secretly helping humanity evolve and all this kind of other stuff. Nothing new under the sun, as we see Solomon say in the Bible, but hey, Other cults started actually out from therapist groups, right? Self-help groups. And these self-help groups, right, like the Sullivanians, like Nevi'im or whatever, they started trying to, basically market themselves to vulnerable and mentally disturbed folks who were looking for some kind of support, some kind of help, and who ended up in a nightmare web of disaster, and who were eventually told that they could not get better without the therapies that they were being put through at these places. So with all that said, right, we've got an image of a lot of cult behavior that seems to, according to the APA Dictionary of Psychology, it really seems to, at its most baseline, be defined like this, right? A cult is a religious or quasi-religious group characterized by unusual or atypical beliefs, seclusion from the outside world, and an authoritarian structure. Cults tend to be highly cohesive, well-organized, secretive, and hostile to non-members. And so you'll notice it says religious or quasi-religious. Again, as we could see with some of these more psychotherapy-based groups, that's not necessarily the case. Doesn't have to be that. But those other things there are still important, right? Highly authoritarian with a hierarchical structure, well-organized, secretive, hostile to outside members. Something where everyone outside is like a danger or an enemy or a suspect. Everyone inside is part of this group that must, kind of fall in line with the expectations imposed by this very top-down hierarchy. And whatever thoughts you're thinking, stick them in your hat for later. Even today, though, a lot of places do seem to have problems with cults. If you are someone who has ever played or watched someone play the game series Yakuza, you might notice that a recurring theme seems to be the occasional goofy little cult member that happens to be around as part of the background NPCs. And if you've watched anime, sometimes that comes up as a plot line that there are some cult members in Japan just doing weird, goofy stuff and giving lots of money to basically grifters. If that's your only understanding of Japanese cultures, anime, and video games, which is not an accurate reading of Japanese culture, you might be inclined to think that they have a big problem with cults. And for once, this assumption might not be totally off the mark, I'm not gonna lie. Based on Japan today, there was this kind of discussion of like why cults in Japan appear, why they're so prevalent, and when the government started getting a lot more suspicious of what they otherwise thought were just like goofy, harmless, like tiny religious groups at the time. Lots of crazy stuff has happened in relation to what was defined as cult behavior. Everything from like serious attacks on like tons of people that resulted in like thousands of people injured at one point, to even the assassination of Shinzo Abe, right? That allegedly had connections to that, or at least was part of the motivation for his assassination. Wild stuff. Read that article if you want more details on that. But from that article is one very good quote that might let us understand why the hell this becomes such a thing, why people get wrapped up in cults to begin with. And That quote says, despite government crackdowns and public scrutiny, cults remain a large, pervasive issue in Japan. New religious movements continue to emerge, often targeting vulnerable individuals seeking community or spiritual answers. While efforts to curb exploitative practices are underway, the complex history and ongoing controversies surrounding cults underscore the difficulty of addressing this deeply ingrained societal issue. So, Japan is one place. They're certainly not the only place dealing with it. What we can glean from that quote is that people join cults in Japan, in America, in Europe, doesn't matter where. They join cults because they are so disturbed by a very tumultuous and uncertain world where the future is not clear, where values that they have been told they need to hold on to are suddenly shaken, challenged, and otherwise not proving to give the returns they are promised to give. Right? Think about if you've been told your whole life that if you just go to college, you'll get a good job and live a good life, and this societal promise has rapidly fallen apart, right? These kinds of things. When we have nowhere else to turn, a lot of people start either regressing towards traditional values, which we can see in things like the hemline index, where, in societally and economically rough times, the length of people's skirts, the modesty factor of clothing seems to suggest something about the psychological state of the people and the economic situation surrounding them. And also where, a lot of this, we need to go back. We need to make America great again. We need to, go back to family values, and all this other kind of rhetoric starts really showing up, ramping up, because when you don't know what's ahead of you, you end up turning around and going back to what you knew. Even if it didn't work the best, the devil you know is better than the one you don't, right? Makes me think of those squirrels when you're driving down the road and they're halfway across the road and then they see your car and they freak out and they turn back. They do that because they don't really know where to go to escape the danger coming at them, but they do know that where they just came from did not have danger, and they don't know that about what's ahead of them. At the end of the day, humans are just animals, and we are not very different. We're going to go back to what we know, even if it's not the best, rather than gamble on what we don't know and risk it all when we are in such uncertain and difficult times. Couple that with the fact that we are social creatures who deeply require a sense of belonging and validation to reduce anxiety in ourselves, and cults also make a lot of sense, right? Cults that tell you that, you are worthy of this group, that you are going to find your place here and your belonging, that if you just follow these set of very strictly defined rules, that you will have everything you need to be perfectly protected in this world, that if you just trust your dear leader, that they will bring you towards something good and something, safe for the low price of monthly membership or whatever. Yeah, that kind of rhetoric is going to catch a lot of people who are feeling very stressed about a world that is just too complex and big for any one person to navigate. Understandable. Totally understandable. However, just like when you make maple syrup and you boil it down a little too far and get those goofy little, maple sugar candies that you see all the time, so too did this whole anti-cult movement and all the fear around it, right? All of the fear of, these cults brainwashing the youth and destroying, the nuclear family and traditional family values in America. Just like, all of that. When you boil that down, you get it more specific. It goes from a whole total anti-cult movement, whether the cults are based in Christianity or aliens or just psychotherapy and postmodern and whatever the hell, all of that gets condensed down into Satanism over time, right? So just check this out. So according to this source, Dangerous Games with the Moral Panic Over Role-Playing Games says about play, religion, and imagined worlds. Really interesting book, by the way. Specifically in its chapter on the Satanic Panic, it says this, right? Which is just fascinating to me. After Charles Manson's arrest for the aforementioned, situation that he did that we talked about, the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner ran a front-page article titled "Hippie Commune Witchcraft Blood Rites Told." All of this coincided with a popular fascination with the demonic demonstrated in such films as Rosemary's Baby in 1968, The Exorcist in 1973, and The Omen in 1976. Like The Devil Rides Out, which was like an earlier kind of 1930s like Pulp Fiction type stuff, these films invited audiences to imagine a satanic threat lurking beneath the surface of modern society. Jay's Journal, 1978, explored these fears and connected them to larger concerns about adolescence. So the focus of that chapter in that book is definitely on like role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons and other things that became, collateral damage in the Satanic Panic. But Charles Manson really didn't have like a ton to do with anything specifically satanic. Not gonna lie, not quite. And yet a lot of these cults, they started to kind of seemingly drift that way, right? Around the 60s is also when we did see the Satanic Bible pop up, Anton LaVey's Satanism pop up, and all of these other things. And so naturally that became like a really obvious thing for people to start clinging on to, especially as people started, kind of artistically displaying a lot of their fears through films like all of those occult horror films that we just mentioned. Now, instead of it just being a general anti-cult movement with a bunch of different moving pieces, we can all collectively say that these cults in general are all Satanism. They're all satanic, and they're all evil, and they're all out to brainwash our children and make them the pawns of Satan and all this other kinds of crazy stuff. And that's where the Satanic Panic really started kicking off. To which I must now go over to John Brackett's journal article, Satan, Subliminals, and Suicide, the Formation and Development of an Anti-Rock Discourse in the United States during the 1980s. This source is also really cool, and right away he opens with this really just powerful image of an American news segment basically called 2020, right? Like kind of like hindsight's 2020. That's the little trick there, I think, on that. But the opening statement goes like this, right? On May 16th, 1985, the American news program 2020 featured a segment entitled The Devil Worshippers. In his introduction to the segment, news anchor Hugh Downs explained that there have been a series of criminal acts reported around the country that have had unique characteristics that link them together. And the source of all of this is the apparent practice of Satanism. That's worship of the devil, right? And so it's like a half-hour program where reporter Tom Jerial, law enforcement officials, psychologists, and former cult members describe a variety of perverse, hideous acts that defy belief. In addition to reports of churches and graves being desecrated with satanic symbols, including inverted pentagrams and the number 666, The Devil Worshippers describes how reports of murders, missing and abused children, and the slaughter of animals may be associated with satanic rituals and ceremonies. So this whole thing, and this whole segment, it really was trying to drive home this idea that there is a secret, spooky dooky, underground collection of just Satanists out there to burn the Christian world down and spit on all of our lovely, American Western Christian values or something. And later this article goes on to say how Jerial over there, he would go into record stores and movie stores and bookstores and show how easy it was for the kids to get their hands on stuff like Rosemary's Baby, like The Exorcist, like Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible, like all these other things as proof that there was just this growing countercultural satanic pushback against Christianity. The thing is, though, that for all of the high publicity around stuff like this, for all of the interesting accounts of apparent ex-satanic cultists or cult escapees, and all of these, criminal cases and other things that went on, such as the McMartin preschool trial that went on for 7 years between 84 and 1990, the FBI did not find any extensive evidence of some kind of just like evil satanic cult operating behind the scenes to try and just completely implode American society. And in fact, by the end of the 90s, this is why the Satanic Panic would eventually fizzle out. Because a lot of the people who were making allegations of how they escaped, these satanic cults and all of the horrible, terrible things that they were being forced to do in these cults, all kinds of abuse and sacrifice and blah, 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 all of that stuff that they were saying in their testimonies and in their books and in their, court transcripts and everything else, it was largely unfounded. And in fact, there were a lot of therapists actually sued for implanting false memories in their patients' heads, and a lot of cases where hypnosis seems to have been a bit more suggestive than it needed to be, and really just kind of got people all twisted up and saying things that were just not verifiable in any way. One really good example of these kinds of testimonies is the book Michelle Remembers, based on the testimonies of a certain Michelle Smith, who, according to Dangerous Games, she suffered from depression and had been seeing a psychiatrist named Lawrence Pazder for several years. In 1976, after having a miscarriage, Michelle commented that she needed to tell him something but did not know what it was. Over the next 14 months, Pazder led Smith through hundreds of hours of hypnosis. During this time, Smith repeatedly regressed to the age of 5 and relived experiences that supposedly took place in 1954. Smith alleged that her mother had been part of a satanic cult and that she had been seriously abused with stuff that was just so wild that people believed the book because they said it was too crazy to make up, basically. Unfortunately, though, that is what happened. It was largely made up. Hypnosis is not exactly the most, like, you know, ironclad method of therapy or you know, unlocking repressed memories necessarily. And so that kind of stuff just continued to happen. Likewise, with the McMartin preschool trial, it was alleged that people who were you know, watching over the children at this daycare center were abusing the kids, that the kids, you know, were seeing the staff do all kinds of crazy stuff like flying and like all this other wild stuff. And the person who brought all this forward, Judy Johnson, a parent of one of these children, she alleged that her child had been, you know, seriously abused by the staff, you know, and all these kinds of things. The problem is, though, this trial took 7 years, took a lot of money to prosecute. It ended with no material evidence. Judy Johnson, however, was institutionalized for acute schizophrenia. This is not to say, obviously, that these kinds of institutions have never had issues with, you know, abuse of any kind, but it is to say that this was during a time of serious satanic panic, and that the McMartin trials especially were in a high-profile case around satanic stuff because of all of these, you know, weird accusations coming out about, like, this underground kind of, like, ritualistic situation. Granted, today in 2026, we have a little bit of a different situation now that we're all looking at and saying, oh, geez, wait, did they have a point? No, we're going to get into that later because that's actually very important to why all of this satanic panic, subterfuge, and smoke and mirrors matters. Tuck that one in your hat for later, too. The bottom line is that there just wasn't any evidence that this was linked to some grand satanic conspiracy, right? You know, like, even if there had been any evidence of, like, abuse or anything like that, to say that it was connected to Satanism doesn't make a lot of sense, but it did put that case in the limelight for a long time, even though nothing came out of it for all of the money and time and attention spent on it. So obviously it's worth to investigate claims, it's worth to look into and see if these things happen, but the reason it dragged on so long as it did is definitely because of these issues with satanic panic, with believing that there's some kind of underground thing that the FBI even was just trying to cover up when it said that it had no credible evidence to assume that. And actually, if we look at this source, this is problematic for multiple reasons, one of which being that for a long time, a great way to poison a jury against a defendant was to accuse them of having some kind of satanic ties or influences, right? There's a lot of reasons why stuff like this matters, one of which being that if you could say that someone is a Satanist or something, you can very easily get a jury biased against them and much more likely to, you know, mark them guilty of something, even if their religious affiliation has no bearing on a crime that was committed, even if that whole idea of them being a Satanist isn't actually even materially true in the first place. But that's a side note. We'll for later. Tuck it in your hat. We got like 3 things tucked in the hat right now. We're gonna have a very decorated cap by the end of this. Nonetheless, one thing I do find really interesting in Dangerous Games that they talk about with this, right? With this parental concern around, you know, the daycare centers, with this situation we are all, you know, watching play out where these accusations of Satanism are ramping up, is this. So the author is saying, it's difficult to understand how this could have happened in a society that has public education and modern forensics and technology and values individual rights. One person, they're quoting Bromley, which I'm assuming is like a psychologist of some kind. They say, Bromley attempts to make sense of the panic by suggesting that claims about Satanists abducting and abusing children were an attempt to articulate social concerns and frustrations that could not be expressed otherwise. The real threat, he argues, was that a changing economy in which both parents frequently worked required Americans to rely increasingly on strangers to care for and raise their children. The covenantal sphere of family life was being compromised by the contractual sphere of the market, and parents felt helpless to halt this process. Bromley explains, quite simply, parents have been losing control over the socialization process to various external service providers that operate relatively independently of individual families. Visible evidence of family resistance to this trend is found in the plethora of family-based grassroots movements seeking to reassert control by nominating as social problems such family-related issues as drug use, missing and abducted children, heavy metal rock music, fantasy games, religious cults, sexuality and violence in the media, and all these other kinds of things, right? So, and he would suggest also that claims of satanic cults may be metaphorically true if empirically false, meaning that even if there's no tangible evidence of satanic cults doing this stuff, there is this pervading truth that something is happening to the family unit, that something is happening to traditional American family values. There's some, as this author of this book puts it, some kind of invisible force that seemed to be all around them, corrupting their children and undermining the values of the family. This anxiety was expressed in symbolic terms, and these symbols were then mistaken for reality. Daycare providers were frequently accused of abuse and these things because they were the most readily available manifestation of the contractual sphere on which modern parents depended on to raise their children. In persecuting professionals who cared for their children, claims makers were attacking the symbols of their problem rather than the problem itself. That's massive. That is huge, because really what we're seeing here is that, once again, people will blame goddamn everything except capitalism. You both need to work and you don't have time to care for your kids anymore. No. It's not because the economic system which we live in is not conducive to the family life anymore. It's not because the old nuclear model of wife stay home, do everything while man go work is now obsolete. No. It's not because the economic system and the social reality and feminism and all these other things happening at the time are causing our reality to shift. No, it's some magical secret satanic cult. Tuck this in your head. Thing number 4, decorated cap of things, because this is going to come back later. Still, right? So this is where we're starting to get here. The Satanic Panic is, as this seems to be American tradition, really attacking the leaves on this tree of problems rather than getting at the root of the problems. They are pointing at things like, rock and roll music and video games and role-playing games and fantasy media. Like, just imagine, right? Think of all the people who flipped out about the Golden Compass. Fuck. All this kind of stuff. They are out here just saying, oh, it's all this stuff. It's these trading card games. It's all this stuff that is, brainwashing our children into being these satanic, society-hating, anti-Christian thugs rather than, just more complex social and political and economic phenomena happening at the time. So really, the big point here is that, the Satanic Panic, it lasted probably about to the end of the 90s, but by that point, it started sliding away for a myriad of different reasons. Suddenly, we found a lot of different scapegoats, right? With 2001, 9/11 happened, and suddenly the focus went from Satanism to radical Islamic terrorism, and suddenly the focus went from fantasy media to specifically just violent video games, all the kind of shoot 'em up video games and all this other kind of stuff, and also with the 9/11 situation came also much harder crackdown on anti-American or anti-patriotic sentiments, which totally threw a wrench in the grunge genre and all of the other bands that were very commonly, popular, criticizing of American empire, right? Like Rage Against the Machine and a lot of other ones. This would not stop them, obviously. Rock music gonna do what rock music wanna do, and in fact, these sources are very good about this. You should definitely check these out. But, of course, right, rock music is still gonna criticize the empire, the machine, and all these other things. It's going to keep going, but it is going to be easier to label them, anti-American, domestic terrorists, and all this other kinds of just dumb nonsense that is the same in spirit as the Satanic Panic, but just uses different words. And that's why this is important. So that's why, on this little scope down memory lane, when we have all of this nonsense fears about stuff, and we have all of these, rock musicians taking the fall, like Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath and Marilyn Manson and all these other things, we see the real reason why the Satanic Panic matters, and that's because this is the same damn playbook that every sociopolitically dominant group has used against those that it wants to quash and against those whose voices it wants to drown out, to basically make spherical and round and uniform and hegemonic the dominant social narrative. To show you what I mean by that, let me read you a little quote here. I'm going to throw some blanks in there, and I want you to fill those blanks in. Okay, I want you to, I don't know, wherever you are, just pause after I read this and comment and fill in those blanks with whatever you think fits here. The story has the same features as many astonishing cult stories: coercion, sexual abuse, child neglect, extreme paranoia, disowning of families, theft, and kidnapping. But one of the most astonishing aspects of this story is the way it shows the practice of blank blurring into a form of social control. Perhaps it suggests the things that draw a person into an insular community are the same things that many of us also seek in blank. To find support, to be offered a reflection of ourselves, which in too many cases means an ugly picture as we believe ugly things, and to defy the terribly unsettling fact that we have no control over anything. Just take a minute. What goes in those blanks? What goes in these blanks here? If you said religion, actually, good guess, but that isn't correct. This is talking specifically about psychotherapy, because this is a quote coming from an article on the Sullivanians, who, had this really interesting kind of cult in the Upper West Side of New York City that was actually based a lot on the defiance of, Freudian kind of nature-nurture theory and defiance of the nuclear family unit, and that was very into like postmodernist thought and all these other things. That in itself is an insane story, honestly. That is just a good example of how a cult can start in non-religious senses. This one being more about psychotherapy, run by people who had no qualifications or business doing nothing with therapy or psychology, and evolving into something like seriously just abusive and harmful to many, many people over time. But if you said religion, totally understandable that you did, because that is what we see a lot of times with high control religion. I keep bringing this book back up, and I'm going to keep bringing it up because it's so on point to all of this. But When Religion Hurts You by Laura E. Anderson is a book all about how, her own experience in a Christian high control group, not a cult, but like an actual like church denomination, basically kind of informed her background, personal experience to all of them, the psychology and the studies and the other things she talks about in the book. And the main thing is that high control religions, they focus exactly on what the definition of a cult told us earlier, right? They focus on this very top-down structure, on this, serious hierarchy where the leader is always right. The leader, is very spiritual or very learned or something like that, where free thought is discouraged, questions are discouraged as not having enough faith, where you have to follow a very strict set of rules in order to be considered a good member, someone in good standing, where, you're kind of walking on eggshells because at any point the things that you think are right or good might not be approved by leadership. Like this book was talking about how her youth group pastor like flipped his lid because she decided to start dating a boy in high school. Wild stuff. I mean, you know what I mean? A lot of what we see Christian denominations do, not really even entire denominations, but specific churches, what we see a lot of specific churches in certain, especially evangelical denominations do these days, is operate in these high control cult manners. They do this very, hierarchical situation, men on top, women on bottom, or children on the very, very bottom. They do this kind of thing where you're not really supposed to question, you're not really supposed to, challenge the leadership in any way. You are a heretic, you are not faithful, you are a lost sheep or whatever. If you do question and if you leave, then you are ostracized, you are cut off. You are, just completely abandoned. Rev Karla from TikTok also talks about this in her book that she wrote on her experience, where once she left the church, all of those that she considered her friends just disappeared. They just did not bother reaching out to her, continuing to keep up any social relations with her. There was nothing. It was just radio silence, because she was out of the group and therefore nothing mattered, right? She talks a lot about her own experience with this kind of abuse in the church with, being yelled at, with being mistreated, with being overworked and not at all compensated for time whatsoever, with being expected to constantly do more and more and more free labor, and all these other things that are par for the course for these kinds of high control situations. The reality is, right, that like we see a real the call is coming from inside the house moment here. Whereas people were so focused on these very obvious and terrible moments of, actual cults happening in the 60s and the 70s, right, with all of the Jim Jones and Charles Manson, stuff like that. While these were genuinely horrible situations, and there were many cults, and there still are cults that are really, really damaging and harmful to people outside mainstream Christianity, the reality is a lot of denominations and a lot of specific churches within denominations of mainstream Christianity function the same way. And they function this way so that they can justify and cover up a lot of their own abuse, right? There doesn't have to be some evil satanic cabal or some shit for there to be massive amounts of abuse in the church, both, special abuse of children and women and just like violent, psychological abuse. This is not anything I think anyone in good conscience can deny about Christianity overall as an institution. Whether we're talking about the Catholic Church and all of that abuse that was covered up officially, and all the priests and bishops that were protected for their abuse, whether we're talking about Baptists, in which Russell Moore, former president of the Southern Baptist Convention, was pushed out for attempting to, try and investigate and expose this problem of abuse within the church. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The common denominator here is that these powerful figures in these churches were the ones with incentive to keep people quiet and obedient so that they can continue to do this stuff. And you'll see a lot of this charted out in books like Tim Alberta's The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. You'll see that what was supposed to be just a normal church of normal people doing normal Christian stuff ends up looking more like some kind of mafia situation, like some kind of insane organized crime ring of all kinds of abuse, fraud, and everything else in between. Much like actual cults that people said were so bad, and I mean rightfully so, but that they didn't realize could also maybe apply to their own situations. And again, as I've said before, this kind of rhetoric has existed everywhere all the time across multiple cultures, multiple times and spaces, and has targeted multiple people. So when I'm reading all of this about Satanic Panic, I found myself thinking, oh wow, this sounds a lot like what I was reading about, the creation of that old book, Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of the Witches, right? This book was used to justify, persecuting women as witches for like the most random bullshit that was completely nonsensical, right? Saying that if a woman had like a mole or a freckle, that was a witch's teeth that she was suckling demons from, and that was proof that she was, that kind of stuff that you learned about in like 9th grade history when we started getting into witch trials and stupid shit. That, right? Well, that book is based on an earlier book called the Malleus Judaeorum, the Hammer of the Jews, in which an entire population of people, Jewish people, in Germany were singled out as basically being these evil, terrible creatures mulling around and trying to kidnap Christian children to drain them of their blood for their evil Jewish rituals, which is the origin of the term blood libel. It is slander and libel against these people, right, making them out to be these horrible demons when none of this was even true, never mind reasonable to accuse anyone of, and just really fueled anti-Semitism in this area and in this time. And as you might imagine, led to their ever-increasing persecution and destruction. But it's the same playbook as with the Satanic Panic. You identify some group, whether real or imagined, honestly doesn't even seem to matter. You identify some group, and you make up all of this nonsense about them that justifies your hatred and persecution of them, while also painting yourself as the victim of their evil, nefarious deeds to further justify your persecution and hatred of them. In fact, I picked up this book from the library right now. It is Separation of Church and Hate, A Sane Person's Guide to Taking Back the Bible from Fundamentalist, Fascist, and Flock-Fleecing Frauds by John Fugelsang. And this is an awesome book about this too, written very easily for folks to grasp and understand, because the point is, everyone's gotta know this stuff. Everyone's gonna know this stuff. And he also makes this point that, like, hey, guess what? When you are able to basically vilify your oppression, When you are basically able to vilify your opposition, when you are able to say that they are evil, that they are dangerous, that they are harmful, you can do two things. You can posit yourself as the victim, which is always necessary to justify any kind of defensive measures, and you can also justify your refusal to cooperate, listen to, compromise anything with those people. Because why would you compromise or listen to or talk to or sit down at the table with these agents of Satan? In fact, in Fugelsang's chapter, Master Race Christians of the 21st Century and How to Debate Them, he goes on to say, right, life's pretty simple for the authoritarian Christian, since most of their opinions happen to also be God's opinions, and they believe they are the folks who get to speak for God. They generally feel divinely obliged to control whatever part of society they see fit, you know, for God. And if you're one of the anointed who speaks for the Almighty, eventually you're liable to believe that anyone who opposes you is logically on the side of Satan. And God's true people are never going to sit down and negotiate things like school curriculum, women's rights, or marriage equality with Lucifer. People who've been conditioned to think you're on the side of the devil aren't permitted to meet you halfway. In contemporary America, the two most dominant forces within right-wing Christianity are fundamentalism and Christian nationalism. These two umbrella term movements wield the Bible to gain control over society in different ways, and they both suffer life-threatening allergies to the actual teachings of Jesus. Now, here's the thing. As you might imagine, right? Satanic Panic, Malleus Iudiotum, all these other kinds of things, radical Islamic terror, whatever the fuck it is that these people are pointing out as this grave threat on America and Christian values and blah, 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 which you'll notice Christian nationalism makes America and Christianity one and the same. It works to do exactly what Fugelsang's talking about, which is to basically demonize your opponent, whoever the hell they are, real or imagined, and to therefore justify not listening to them. To justify destroying them rather violently, right? To justify, not even considering their viewpoints and instead just full horn going after your own wishes with no regard for anyone else's opinion on the matter. And just like, these sources were talking about how these occults, fascinations like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist and all that were coming up in like the 60s and 70s, they're coming up again now. Right? When we have movies like Tarot from 2024, The Pope's Exorcist 2023, the Netflix series Marianne from 2019, and also ones like Hereditary from 2018. We've got this resurgence again in this kind of like Satanic Panic flavored stuff. I remember as a witchy person who uses tarot cards, seeing the movie called Tarot and saying, oh no, I know exactly where this is going, and I was not incorrect. Oh my god. This is coming up again where as people are getting more spiritually open, spiritually free, and leaving the church, where they are now classifying themselves less as Christian specifically and more just spiritual TM, once again, you've got books like Lucas Miles' Pagan Threat popping up, which we did a long video on as well, where we're really just trying to make this gigantic, buzzword soup of a book that insists that America's problem is all these pagans and all of these Satanists and all of these Luciferians who are trying to destroy America with their hermetic Marxism and globalist, evil schemes to make people believe in the fallacies of climate change and whatever the hell else this guy was talking about. Ridiculous book. Definitely go look at the longer breakdown of that. But all of these things, right? Like we're once again in the shit in the Middle East, just like we were in the early 2000s. We are out here, saying that we need Jesus to come back soon, and, we're trying to push all this Christian values and all this nonsense. We are out here with the Satanic Panic, with the Pagan Threat, with all this other nonsense. It's all just coming back up again, but this time it really does feel like, a speed run of everything, right? It feels like shitty Empire's greatest hits just down the line, getting thrown out, where everyone except one very specific and myopic view of Christianity is the bad one that we all must fight against, right? It's an old tactic, it's an old playbook, and we've seen it happen again with the rise of the, stuff we're seeing in the Epstein files, where people are out here trying to make this kind of like satanic panic issue again with, Epstein had bank accounts called Moloch and Baal, and these were ancient Canaanite deities that people would sacrifice children to and blah, blah, blah. They're making up all this conspiracy about the possible religion that Epstein and any of the people engaged in the horrible stuff in those files could be from, and missing the very obvious point, the very obvious unification between all of these things, be it Epstein, be it the church, be it cults, be it any of this. And that is that people with unchecked power and resources over other people are going to suddenly do some very suspect and awful stuff to the people in their care. We realize that this whole, satanic panic, the whole radical Islamic terror, and watch out, they're bringing Sharia law to America, and watch out, all of this cult behavior, all of this brainwashing, all of it is, again, the call coming from inside the house. A lot of these people in the Epstein files were not some magical cabal of Satanists. They were people who subscribed to a lot of modern popular religions, whether it be Christianity, whether it be Islam, Judaism. Those are the ones that get thrown around the most, not because these religions agree with any of the stuff in those files or say that it's right and good and you should do it, but because they're the most popular religions in the world, comprising billions of people, and your statistical odds of someone being one of those is going to be a lot higher than someone being a fucking Satanist, which has a much, much tinier percentage of the population literally anywhere, right? So it's all smoke and mirrors. It's all to try and get people to latch on to this enemy that, again, as I quoted earlier from that source saying, might be metaphorically true rather than empirically true. It's trying to get you to latch on to these boogeymen, basically. These scapegoats that don't even really actually exist to distract you from what they themselves are doing. And I tell you now, again, the through line between all of these situations, between the psychotherapy cults, the religious cults, the big mainline denominations, or the secret dark underbellies of trafficking and abuse, all of them are strung together not by any one religion or by Satan, but by the simple influence of power and money. And no one wants to acknowledge that. No one wants to acknowledge that it's capitalism tearing their kids away from them rather than some magical satanic conspiracy. No one wants to acknowledge that it is the rich people who this country has taught us to idolize that are the actual source of society's ills, rather than some random shadowy, collection of Satan worshippers. No one wants you to believe that the people who are telling you this bullshit are the ones, in fact, who need to be looked at. And that's the problem that as I was putting all this together, I was really having with all of this. Because I was looking at all of this and I was saying, holy shit. What I thought was going to be a quick chat about, haha, wasn't it so silly and goofy what people were thinking in the 80s and 90s? Wasn't it so silly? I realize is still extremely present, and in fact is still the symptom of a much larger social problem, which is that we keep letting certain dominant social groups in society tell us who to fear, what to think, and where the problem is, so that they can obscure their own actions from public view. The rich, the powerful, regardless of what religion they claim or don't claim, are the ones who keep manufacturing these crises and trying to control the social narrative, trying to hegemonize and trying to really, make smooth and clean this, societal structure, this societal picture, as if everything has always been so neat and simply and easily explained. And this, in fact, brings me to my rather insane conclusion, which is that, ironically, if we know what Satan actually is, who Satan actually is in the Bible, if we understand a more actually biblical and especially rabbinic understanding of Satan, it's really funny to say this, but actually the concept, the archetype of Satan might be more on the side of the common people than anything else. Stay with me. I'll explain what I mean. Because really, if you look at the Bible, there are 2 times that the term morning star or Lucifer shows up. That is once in Isaiah 14:12, where it's talking about, oh, son of the dawn, right? How you've fallen, which is a reference to Babylonian King Nebuchadnezzar II. And it also shows up in the New Testament in Revelation 22:16, where Jesus Christ himself calls himself the bright and morning star. Early Christians would go on to say that this was Lucifer, who was Satan, who was whatever, you know, this angel of light that fell and tried to rally God's angels against him and and all this kind of shit. That is fan fiction, let me be so patently clear. But I'm going to say this and it's going to drive you wild, but Jesus is a Satan, a Shaitan, to the religious elites and the, you know, those in power that he was rebuking so heavily in the Gospels. Because Satan, or Ha-Shatan, literally just means adversary. Literally just means like an opponent, right? Not even necessarily always a negative opponent, but an adversary. And if we check out this book, this is just a really interesting book, it explains kind of how Satan went from basically God's prosecution, which is the rabbinic, right, Jewish rabbinic view that Satan is God's prosecutor, the one in charge of pointing fingers, accusing us, testing us, seeing if we slip up, collecting that evidence, like screenshotting it all and sending it to God. And then later in the Christian tradition, becoming more of the active enemy of God, the, you know, cosmic force opposing God. So that's a really cool book, but that idea is really what I'm talking about when I'm saying that, like, Satan actually might become our ally in this situation, because Satan is the prosecutor. Satan is the one collecting this information, pointing it back at people and saying, hey, is this you? And that's what I feel like all of these articles about, like, you know, the anti-rock movements, the Satanic Panic, you know, how moral panic against Marilyn Manson and everything else, that's what I think these articles are pointing to. The fact that Satan has always been that shadow of the Christian church. And to put this in very, like, Jungian terms, right? The shadow being a concept of Carl Jung's psychology. The shadow is something that is everything basically that we don't like about ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge. The shadow is all of our ugly traits, all of our darkness, all of our, you know, maybe not so awesome impulses and instincts that we are told in society are not good, are not honorable, are not conducive to social life, and that therefore we should be ashamed of. And so Carl Jung is positing that with the shadow, an unhealthy relationship with it, and a refusal to integrate it into oneself, to actually accept it and work with it rather than against it, causes people to project it out onto others. Causes people to basically see all the things they hate in themselves in others, and therefore persecute others for what they are perceiving as others' faults, because it could never be their own. Because if they accept it as their own faults, that does serious material damage to the self-image, or the ego, rather, right? The self-image is what we believe about ourselves, that we are good, that we are kind, that we are generous, that we are good friends, that we are, you know, good parents and good spouses and all these other things. The shadow, if we confront that and we don't like what we see, it stands to really injure our self-image and complicate it. And the brain cannot handle that, right? That creates a lot of cognitive dissonance, that creates genuine pain in the brain, like physical pain. So your options are to either accept that you weren't as awesome as you thought you were, that you're a little bit more complex, that you got a little bit shades of gray to you rather than just black and white, or to cast it out and to graft it onto other people to kind of beat them up for your own failures. When it comes to the Christian church, we see them constantly projecting their worst aspects onto everything else in society. And as someone who grew up listening to a lot of rock music, and especially music like Marilyn Manson, that struck me immediately, right? Because when I heard music like Marilyn Manson's, I always heard a singer who was obviously playing up the shock value. Of course, he's purposely going out of his way to make himself look grotesque in his music videos and, you know, really just do all this shock value. But his lyrics and the sound bites he's using are very obviously him addressing the hypocrisy of the Christian church, the hypocrisy of America itself as a nation, claiming all these Christian values while doing all this horrible shit. Same thing with Rage Against the Machine, right? All these, like, Born of a Broken Man is a great example of that. So, like, all of this stuff, it's to shock people, to really shove it in their face that, hey, you're a fucking hypocrite. And the stuff that you claim to believe, you obviously don't, because the proof is not in that pudding, right? Your actions do not match your words. And actually, it's really interesting because in this source specifically about Manson, right, we get a quote from these French economists. And this guy, Attali, he's saying, listening to music is listening to all noise, realizing that its appropriation and control is a reflection of power, and that it is essentially political, and that music is prophecy. It makes audible the new world that will gradually become visible, right? And so they're also saying that this is why rock musicians are so dangerous, disturbing, and subversive, because in this society where they're trying to sanitize media, right, where they're trying to control the narrative, to only push certain news stories, only push certain fiction, only push certain programming, rock musicians continue to basically just line up a gun on people's face and pop it off. They keep shooting an arrow directly into the beating heart of the problem here, which is all of that hypocrisy, which is all of that mess, right? They continue to defy these socio-political norms that keep trying to mold people's perception of what is acceptable in good music and what is not. Still, right, going back to Attali, I mean, like, he's saying some great shit. He's saying everywhere we look, the monopolization of the broadcast of messages, the control of noise, and the institutionalization of the silence of others assure the durability of power. The monologue of standardized stereotypical music that you're going to find on like radios or anything like that accompanies and hems in a daily life in which in reality no one has the right to speak anymore, except those among the exploited who can still use their music to shout their suffering. For this reason, musicians are dangerous, disturbing, and subversive, right? So basically, in this world where, you know, you're not allowed to voice your discontent, you're not heard when you do it, countercultural music, the rock music, the thrashing, all of that, you know, disdainful, terrible, spooky, satanic stuff, it's the stuff that's still speaking to power, the real hurt and pain of people. Like, no one in their right mind is going to read or listen to Marilyn Manson's albums and be like, yeah, this is a person who, like, definitely, you know, is well-adjusted and had a great childhood and, like, lives in an American system that is totally working as intended, or, like, you know, as one would hope it would, right? This is someone who's speaking out to the pain that he and many others around him experienced at the hands of hypocritical people. Hypocritical, terrible people who make it everyone else's fault that the world is bad while they're the ones actively in charge. You also see it with, like, fashion, right? Like, right now I'm seeing, you know, some really cool goth Christians on TikTok, and you'll see people be like, you can't dress like this and be Christian, this is bad, as if Christianity only looks one way. Hell, I made a post about this, and this got people all kinds of ways they didn't really understand, but what I'm saying is, a lot of people think that you're supposed to be Christian the first way, that you're supposed to look all clean and cute and, you know, girl-defined and shit, when in reality, Christianity doesn't look any one way. Mine certainly doesn't look that way, as we can see, and the way in which we control the way people dress, the way people talk, the music they listen to, the ideas they express, this all works in the service of these people who are telling you everyone else is the problem while they're making the problems. You see it in fashion, you also see it in spirituality, and this is really where it gets super, super dangerous. Now that people are being more free-thinking, more open-minded, they are exploring their own ways of understanding both Christianity and their own spiritual power, right? Witchcraft and occultism. You've got all kinds of people saying that, oh, this is dangerous, this is bad, this opens us up to spiritual, you know, problems and spiritual warfare and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, no, it opens you up to spiritual warfare, and the spiritual warfare is your dropping church attendance. That's all it really is. And when I say Satan is an ally, what I mean is that, again, for the people who love to say Satan comes as an angel of light and just mysteriously, like, miss what that actually means as they go running headfirst into Joel Osteen's church and Kenneth Copeland's church and all this other shit, these people don't understand that, like, the horror, the shock, all of this stuff that crops up and they claim at least is, you know, pushing back against them. It's because all of that is throwing back in their face the problems they refuse to address in themselves. As someone who is very fascinated by demonology and demonolatry and you know, investigating demons and seeing what they're about and understanding them from both an archetypal and actually, like, spiritual perspective, I have never known demons to actually be the liars that people say that they are. What they are, though, are people who unapologetically and very, very unempathetically throw your own flaws in your face. And whether or not they're lying depends on whether, as Carl Jung puts it, you can integrate your own shadow or whether you have to project it out. Obviously, if you cannot handle the truth about yourself and all the ways you go wrong, you end up projecting it out and creating those demons, creating these mystical forces of oppression and Satanism and whatever that are out to drag you to hell and eat your soul and whatever. But if you can integrate it, you can understand that, oh, all the people that everyone says are so satanic and should be avoided actually have a really big point. And that's that all of this satanic panic nonsense is nothing other than smoke and mirrors, a projection to hide from one's own flaws. Because Marilyn Manson and all of the other artists I've ever listened to who have spit on this kind of religious fanaticism, who have pushed back against it in shocking and grotesque ways, all of them are speaking nothing but the truth when they say that, like, American Christianity is a failure, when American Christianity's biggest enemy is itself. And when, as Fugelsang is saying, when American Christianity seems to be just so deathly allergic to the actual teachings of Christ. And in fact, one lyric from Marilyn Manson's songs always sticks out to me, right? And that is that he, never hated the one true God, but the God of the people he hated. Like, so many times they tell you, the problem isn't like God TM, the problem is people's version of God that they use to beat people on the head with, that they use to scapegoat and justify silencing any dissident. So it's just all of this just kind of spirals in my head into one very obvious point, which is that if someone's telling you to be afraid of something that's demonic and satanic, chances are 9 times out of 10 it's because they've got their own issues that they do not know how to work through, and that they are just little foot soldiers of a much larger empirical machine that has been doing this exact rhetoric for literally hundreds of years across various empires, various cultures, and various peoples. And that is to posit themselves as the true ones of God, while everyone else is a filthy, evil devil worshiper that deserves eradication. This rhetoric is dangerous. This rhetoric easily creates authoritarian and fascist regimes, and this line of thinking absolutely does not want you to use any of the critical thought that you as a human being need to be using in order to see through all of this smoke and mirrors. So with that said, treat yourself to listening to Marilyn Manson's Portrait of an American Family. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about when I keep referencing him. And I hope that the rest of your weekend is spent not too much in a tailspin, but stay aware, stay critical, and remember that if the powers that be want you to believe something, check it twice. And if they don't want you to believe something, check it 3 times. With all that said, I'll see you guys next time for some more chats. So, see ya.